Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Princeton Public Library. I'll introduce myself in just one moment, but I'd first like to make an announcement about this space's accessibility. The community room is T-Coil enabled. If you have T-Coil enabled devices, please feel welcome to switch them on at this time. If you don't have a T-Coil enabled device but would like to use one of our headsets, I've made some available at the small table by the entrance. I'll also request that you silence your cell phones for the duration of this program. My name is Cliff Robinson, and I'm the Public Humanities Specialist here at the Princeton Public Library. This evening's program was made possible in part with support from the National Endowment for the Humanities. We're grateful for the support of Labyrinth Books as well. They've joined us, as is customary, to facilitate a signing which will follow the presentation. So coming to that, it is my honor this evening to introduce our guest, Brianna Nofil, a historian of the modern United States with a focus on migration, incarceration, and law. She received her PhD from Columbia University in 2020 and holds BAs in History and Public Policy Studies from Duke University. Brianna's dissertation received the Allan Nevins Prize from the Society of American Historians and the Outstanding Dissertation Award from the Immigration and Ethnic History Society. She joins us tonight to present The Migrants' Jail, an American History of Mass Incarceration. In this book, the publisher at the Princeton University Press tell us, Brianna Nofil examines how a century of political, ideological, and economic exchange between the U.S. immigration bureaucracy and the criminal justice system gave rise to the world's largest system of migrant incarceration. She shows that migrant detention is not simply an outgrowth of mass incarceration. Rather, it has propelled carceral state building and fostered intergovernmental policing efforts since the turn of the 20th century. From the incarceration of Chinese migrants in New York in the 1900s and 1910s, to the jailing of Caribbean refugees and Gulf South lockups of the 1980s and 90s, federal immigration authorities provided communities with a cash windfall that they used to cut taxes, reward local officials, and build bigger jails, which they then had incentive to fill. Trapped in America's patchwork detention networks, migrants turned to courts, embassies, and the media to challenge the cruel paradox of administrative imprisonment, drawing on immigration records, affidavits, protest letters, and a variety of local sources. Nofil excavates the web of political negotiations, financial deals, and legal precedents that allows the United States to incarcerate migrants with little accountability and devastating consequences. Nicholas Delisle, writing at El País English, describes the book as an examination of a century of political, ideological, and economic exchange between the United States immigration bureaucracy and the criminal justice system, which has given rise to the world's largest system of migrant incarceration. And he observes that Nofil's findings and historical perspective provides clues about a system and a set of strategies that are already in place to detain migrants awaiting trial or expulsion. Kirkus Reviews remarks upon how it treats the forbidding role of imprisonment in the nation's treatment of migrants, calling it an insightful and alarming history of the nation's failures in detaining and deporting migrants. And the New Yorker's briefly noted book reviews writes of The Migrants' Jail that Nofil's book, dense with archival evidence, documents how the federal government has long warehoused immigrants in local jails, and in so doing, evaded oversight and responsibility for horrific, even deadly conditions. This program is presented as part of an emerging series central to the library's Public Humanities Initiative and its annual thematic programming. This year, we are placing our focus on justice, understood not only as a philosophical concept, but also as a lived reality in our society, our streets, and our lives. Those of you who attended the panel on history and restorative justice in Princeton will already be aware of this theme, as that event kicked off our exploration of the topic. Later this month, join us again on March 24th at 6 p.m. for a conversation between Seamus Khan and Musa Al-Gharbi, who will discuss his new book, We Have Never Been Woke, and on March 31st, again at 6 p.m., where historian Connie Goddard will present her book, Learning for Work, exploring the intellectual heritage behind the Bordentown School and an effort underway to reopen the campus both as a school and as an open space for public use. So with all that said, let's thank Brianna for joining us at the library this evening. Brianna, it's yours.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out and spending some time with me. It is such an honor to be here in maybe America's most beautiful public library. And thank you so much to Cliff for facilitating this. So I'm going to start my story today on America's northern border, the border the US shares with Canada. So it is probably not the border that you first think about when you think about immigration politics or perceived immigration crises in the United States. However, in the past year, it has been getting a little more attention. This is from a few months ago. There was a New York Times article about the uptick of folks from Latin America, from Europe, from Asia, who are attempting to enter the United States through Canada, and in particular through the communities of rural northern New York. So migrants are choosing this pathway both because the potential ways to immigrate legally to this country are just incredibly limited and getting more limited by the day, but also because there's just much less policing on the northern border. So I'll stay here. So at the turn of the 20th century, the northern border was far from an afterthought. And particularly this same route that was taking migrants through these communities of rural northern New York was a very big deal. There was tons of concern about migrant smuggling, about the potential for booze smuggling, about European street gangs possibly crossing through this kind of quite rural zone, and so forth. So in 1925, a journalist who was working and writing in northern New York wrote about a peculiar arrangement that had taken root in county jails throughout the region. So he said that New York's four northernmost counties, the counties located right along the Canadian border, had jails that were filled not with people who were accused of violating local laws, but with immigrant detainees awaiting immigration hearings and deportations. So the journalist opined that the federal government had transformed these local jails into boarding houses, paying localities a nightly rate for each migrant they detained. And this is how he described the scene. He said, "Here almost daily, federal officers call for aliens. They are handcuffed, they are led through the main streets of this village to be photographed. Yet the spotlight that plays around Ellis Island is not trained upon small county jails." So this line really stopped me in my tracks when I first read it. It is sort of both a rumination about what it means to be on the peripheries of border enforcement, right? To sort of not get the same attention as Ellis Island gets, but to be doing much of the same work. But I also envision this line as a challenge to historians of immigration and incarceration. So how does the story of migrant incarceration change if we look to these small county jails at the margins? If we look at spaces that are not explicitly marked or called immigration detention sites? And if we look at spaces where the federal government is paying localities a nightly rate for detaining migrants as federal prisoners, money that was frequently just pocketed by the sheriff at the beginning of the 20th century, but was reinvested into expanding jails, expanding prisons, and expanding police forces by the end of the 20th century. So what this journalist encountered in the rural northern expanses of the nation in 1925 continues to play out in the United States a century later. Migration control is a project that relies on local carceral space, local police power, and local community support. And it is a project that continues to make a lot of people a lot of money. I'm going to try to convince you today that it is also a project that has transformed how Americans think about their jails. So over a century of cooperation, of wheeling and dealing, migrant incarceration showed local leaders that jails could be not just sort of an expensive line item on the county budget, something that they considered sort of a liability and frankly very expensive to run, but that the jail could be a product and a service that counties sold to the federal government. So jails could be a space that brought in revenue for local communities. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what immigration detention looks like today before I jump into this history. So immigration detention, at its sort of most basic definition, is the administrative or civil detention of migrants and asylum seekers going through immigration proceedings. So for some folks, that might be deportation proceedings. For some folks, it could be background checks. For other folks, it could be the asylum process. So detention occurs at different points in people's migration journeys. For some people, it is right when they enter the United States. They might move into detention after crossing at a land border or crossing at an airport. But for many other people, detention happens after they've been living in the United States for a long time. So folks are apprehended by ICE at workplaces or jobs, but even more commonly today is that people enter immigration detention after they have had some kind of other interaction with local law enforcement. And this includes things as routine as traffic stops. So ICE and local law enforcement are increasingly well connected today. They share databases, they share biometric information, and so it has never been easier for people to be passed between local law enforcement custody and federal immigration custody. Okay, so people who are detained by the Immigration Service are held in a variety of spaces. So some spaces are migrant-specific facilities designed specifically for migrant detention, but far, far more are just your regular city or county jail, where migrants are just one of many populations held. Okay, so one of my big claims in my work and in my classes is that jails matter so much for understanding the rise of mass incarceration today in ways that I think we haven't fully appreciated. Sort of colloquially, right, people will often use jail and prison interchangeably, but they're actually really different institutions, and jails are particular in a bunch of really key ways. So jails are locally operated, okay? So they're typically county or city level, and they're typically administered by a sheriff. Because they're local, that means they are heavily, heavily influenced by local politics, local priorities, local budgets. In most communities, the sheriff is an elected position, right? So they are sort of uniquely linked to local politics in a way that prisons are not in the same way. Okay, another thing that is really important about jails is that they hold a wide variety of people. Okay, so they hold people who are awaiting trial, pre-trial folks, right, who may or may not be released with the payment of bail. They hold people awaiting transfers. They hold people who have been to trial but have received a relatively short sentence, typically of less than a year. And then they also hold people, as I'm going to talk about, for the federal government. So far, far more people in their lifetime will interact with the U.S. jail than a U.S. prison. The numbers are absolutely staggering, sort of comparatively. Jails have incredibly high turnover rates. But I think for purposes of what I'm talking about, the other thing that's really important to jails is that they exist in virtually every American community. Okay, they're just incredibly widespread. They're thought to be about 2,850 American jails. Okay. So, is migrant detention incarceration? Yeah, it is. So these are photos from Chrome Service Processing Center. This is the detention center in my home community in Miami. This was sort of what originally got me interested in writing about detention. This is a migrant-specific facility. It is located in the Florida Everglades on what was once a missile testing site. And you can see, right, these images sort of have all of the aesthetic things we associate with incarceration. So it is incarceration, but migrant detention is incarceration with even fewer rights. So migrant detention today is still rooted in legal precedents that date back to the Chinese exclusion era. So we get these two cases right before the turn of the 20th century, telling us, first of all, that deportation is not a punishment for a crime, and secondly, that detaining someone pursuant to deportation or immigration proceedings is, quote, not imprisonment in a legal sense, okay? So you do not have to be a legal scholar, right, to say, well, that sounds pretty ambiguous, right? What does it mean for something to be not imprisonment in a legal sense? So in practice, what this has meant, right, is that folks who are experiencing something that looks virtually identical to people who are being detained by the criminal justice system in this country, people who are being detained in these same physical spaces in many cases, have a fraction of the rights and a fraction of the same entitlements to due process. So migrants do not have, for example, the right to legal representation. They do not have the right to trial by a jury, to a speedy trial. And all of those sort of ways that the two systems are kept separate date back to this Fong Yuting case. Okay, so the migrants' jail charts the history of these relationships between communities and the federal government, looking to how the Immigration Service fostered political, ideological, and economic relationships with the small towns throughout the US whose jails it relied on. So even as the federal government built new migrant detention facilities of its own, and even as they secured private prison contractors, county jails continued to serve an essential role. Any perceived crisis, whether it was a scandal about conditions or a natural disaster or an uprising or hunger strike among migrants, could be remedied by moving migrants into these decentralized, nearly invisible outposts. So it has created a system of detention that is virtually impossible to gain a comprehensive view of, and it shows that mass deportations were and continue to be very difficult without the collaboration of local governments. So even though immigration law enforcement is an exclusively federal power, the US has never been able to carry out mass deportations without the help of localities. So I think this has really big stakes for many of the immigration policy debates of today. So debates over migrant busing, right? Can Governor DeSantis ship a bunch of people up to the Northeast? Debates about putting barbed wire across the Rio Grande, right? If Governor Abbott has a legal right to do that. Questions about sanctuary cities and how communities collaborate or refuse to collaborate with ICE. These are all fundamentally debates about how much power local and state governments have in immigration policing. So I think it's really important to kind of understand how these relationships were fostered and evolved to get us to this point today. So this book covers like 100 years. I'm going to talk a little bit about the bookends of the project. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the start and some about the end, and hopefully give you a sense of how detention has changed and expanded into something folks could never have imagined at the start of the 20th century, but also what I see as some of just the really remarkable continuities in how this country has imprisoned migrants. Okay, so my book starts with Chinese exclusion, and in particular, it starts with these jail logbooks from northern New York's Essex County, which is right here. So at the turn of the century, these 4 counties on this map held thousands of Chinese migrants who were attempting to evade the 1882 Chinese exclusion law, which barred all Chinese laborers by entering through Canada. So it is a story that we can reconstruct through newspapers and through federal records, but to my knowledge, these are the only jail logbooks that survive. This is a big challenge of doing jail history. People do not keep jail records. So this was incredible. When I found this, it was just like, oh, so thrilling. So 2 things really stood out to me here. The first is how long detentions were in northern New York. So you can see some of the data we do have here, right, is we have the date that people entered the jail and the date that people exited. So, I crunched all the data from this book. There's about 900 entries. It averaged almost 5 months of detention in a rural county jail. And this is at a time when most scholars who look at, for example, Angel Island on the West Coast say that detentions there typically ran about 2 weeks, okay? So we know that folks who are being detained in northern New York are experiencing incredibly, incredibly long detentions. The second thing that struck me is just how unsuccessful the federal government is in actually removing the people it is jailing. So we can see here, it says like received at jail and then defendant discharged. So discharge means they were released. They were released into the United States. We don't know what happened to them after that. So while in jail, the vast majority of these men, as well as these children, you can see here, this is a child, filed habeas corpus claims arguing that they were U.S. citizens who were being illegally detained. In most cases, after a very long detention, they won these cases. So detention was absolutely miserable in these jails. Inspectors who visited reported that 100 migrants were sleeping in jails designed to hold 12. They note that these spaces are massive public health liabilities. They have no proper ventilation. They're holding double their capacity. One inspector describes the sort of overwhelming odor that hit you the minute you entered this, and he said it is overpowering and sickening. So one of my projects has been trying to figure out how many people actually die in these incredibly unhealthy conditions. And it's a really hard question to answer. In the past, as well as in the present, the government was not eager to report this information. However, we are able to kind of see it in the records because we can see that they are paying for caskets and burials. Okay, so this slide shows over a dozen migrants who I was able to say for certain did die in northern New York jails while attempting to migrate to the US, the youngest of whom up here is 17. So particularly in the wake of deaths, people in communities in northern New York raise real moral and ethical questions about what it means that their communities are monetizing this incarceration of people who are not even accused of a crime. So I'll give you an example. This is from the Malone Farmer. It's a newspaper for farmers. This is not a radical publication. And you can see here, the present Chinese exclusion law and its administration is a shame upon civilized government. They go on, right? There has to be a better system, basically, they write, than keeping Chinese people for months in jails or detention houses for no other cause than seeking to enter this prosperous country. There ought to be some better way of handling them other than placing them behind locked doors and barred windows. So this is a deeply human tragedy, but it is also a story about rural political economy. Observers note that the sheriffs in these communities were eager to be in the migrant detention business because they can earn federal money. And one of the things that is just remarkably, it stunned me, was that you can see these northern counties competing with each other to try to get these federal contracts. They want this immigration detention business to be brought to their community. And they lodge all sorts of arguments for why they and not their neighbor should be sent Chinese migrants. So by 1902, jails in northern New York begin building separate Chinese jails. They're often called, here it's called detention building for Chinese. The more common term we saw was Chinese jail, specifically for the incarceration of Chinese migrants, which they then use as a bargaining tool to access more prisoners. So these towns do not want Chinese residents, but the Chinese prisoner fills a distinct social and economic role. So migrants' economic value to communities is deeply intertwined with ideas about race. So reports are riddled with comments like this, right? I could discover no ill will toward the Chinese among the officials or residents of Malone. My friends about the jail praise their general cleanliness, industry, and docility. Many other reports are going to say some version of the Chinese don't even protest. They enjoy being in the jail, right? It's actually something like a vacation for them. So these statements, of course, have a totally insidious effect. It means that local governments are going to insist they can keep Chinese migrants in horrible conditions with no real effect on the people themselves, reiterating the otherness of the Chinese detainee compared to the American prisoner. But these comments are also quietly erasing the ways that the Chinese are using the courts as a mode of resistance against U.S. immigration law, filing habeas claims on the grounds of citizenship that the U.S. government struggled to disprove. So a stay in jail could be just one step on a realistic and even likely path to citizenship at the turn of the century. Okay, so the story is going to start rapidly changing over the decades to come. So as we start moving into the 1910s and 1920s, the US is going to pass a whole bunch of new immigration laws that are going to target not just migration from China, right, but in particular migration from Europe. So I love this picture from the Boston Globe. It was too low quality to put in the book, so now I got to show you. But we get this lineup, right, of these sort of new faces of immigration detention. So we've got a French Canadian who's failed the literacy test that the US has just installed. We still have some folks from China. We've got a guy down here who's a Chilean, and it says his country will not accept his return. That's a big deal. So we start to see, and then we've also got a guy who is being deported for crime. So the Immigration Service is going to be relying on many of these same jails, but many of the sheriffs are going to say, I don't know if this is worth the trouble anymore. They're going to say, now you're asking us to detain white women and children in the county jail. Now all of these newspapers and embassies are sniffing around and asking questions. This might not be such a great deal for us anymore. So Hastings Hart is the president of the American Prison Association at the time, and he's really sort of disturbed by this idea that there are all of these migrants kind of secretly being held in American jails. He writes to the federal government. He says, can you send me some data on what jails you're using and how much you're paying them, et cetera? And he has met with the response that immigration scholars will get for decades to come, which is we do not have any of that data. Okay, so he is going to pitch a new idea, which is that the government should build federal jails. He says these people are in the custody of the federal government, so the federal government should be responsible for detaining them rather than counties. Okay, so it's one idea, but it shows how sort of general carceral expansion is happening on the basis of immigration law. So around the mid-century, the US is also going to try some other models of detention. One model is going to be renting detention space in office buildings. So this is 630 Sansom Street in San Francisco. It is going to become a space where the U.S. detains hundreds of Chinese women, mostly who are married to American GIs who are immigrating in the 1950s. The government is deeply suspicious of these women. So Angel Island has burned down by this point. So they buy several floors of this regular office building in downtown San Francisco and convert it to a detention center. So pretty much no one has any idea this is happening until this series of episodes where women climb to the roof of the detention center of the office building and threaten to jump. And the sort of retellings of these events, right, they talk about sort of just office workers gathering below and watching these scenes unfold and sort of starting to ask questions for the first time about who all of these people who are trapped in this building are. And it shows, I think, a really important idea, which is that the government is interested in how it can make detention sort of as inconspicuous and out of the way as possible. So along the southern border, right, there's going to be a massive shift of attention towards deportations of Mexican workers in the 1950s as well. The U.S. is going to continue renting jails, but it is also going to start building for the first time these massive federal detention camps. And you can see sort of, I don't know, every time I look at this photo, I am overwhelmed by just the number of people, right? And so they start setting up these detention camps, and they're incredibly controversial, but kind of not for the reasons you might suspect. One of the reasons they're so controversial is because many communities around McAllen say, we expanded our jails. We built bigger jails because the Immigration Service told us it was going to continue to rent beds. And they say, now you're telling us, right, you're building your own detention center? There's this really great quote where they say, the Immigration Service has decided they prefer a concentration camp of their own. And that's just the local government talking. They're anxious, right? They're anxious about losing this money they've come to depend on. Okay. So detention's omnipresence is really going to expand in the 1980s. If you go back to that chart I showed you at the beginning, right, you're going to start to see that really serious incline in the 80s and 90s. Budgets for deportation and removal soared. And under President Reagan, immigration laws shifted to include mandatory detention for asylum seekers and other categories of migrants. A very young Rudy Giuliani will secure the money that the Immigration Service needs to build its first migrant-specific immigration prisons that they will use alongside local jails. But even as, right, these different models are changing and evolving, enterprising sheriffs will continue to see the vast potential for revenue in this system of intergovernmental incarceration. So one of these stories I find particularly fascinating is what happens with Mariel Cubans at jails in the Gulf South in the 80s and 90s. So the Mariel Cubans are a group of refugees, asylum seekers who arrive in this very particular moment in 1980 when Fidel Castro announces that anyone who wants to leave Cuba can leave. About 120,000 people come over the course of about a month to South Florida. They're given a precarious legal status of Cuban Haitian entrant, which is sort of a way of saying not quite refugee. We're trying to figure out what to do. So the big caveat of this identity is that it can be revoked with virtually any criminal offense, even minor ones. But the big problem here is that Cuba also will not accept any deportations. So it essentially creates a population of people in the United States who are being held indefinitely as administrative detainees. So you can imagine people's frustration. There are massive uprisings at detention centers and prisons holding these folks. And the federal government is going to sort of go back to a plan it has fine-tuned over the last several decades, which is if there is a problem at one facility, you take the group of people out of that facility and you scatter them among the nation's jails, right? You scatter them so they can't organize. You scatter so people can't see them. Okay, so one of the communities they are sent to is Avoyelles Parish in central Louisiana, overseen by Sheriff Bill Belt, pictured here. And, this is an incredibly tough time economically for Louisiana, and Belt sees incredible financial potential in this call from the Immigration Service. So once he starts working with the Immigration Service to detain Cubans, he expands and builds new jails in his parish at a stunning rate, even turning a recently desegregated school into a detention facility for migrant women. By the end of the 1990s, Avoyelles has 5 detention facilities holding more Cubans than any other community in the country, the total bed space of over 1,300. Belt, over his time in office, manages to quintuple the sheriff's budget and employ over 400 deputies. So sheriffs around the U.S. are going to make similar observations about the unique financial potential of people who cannot be deported. So in Jackson County, Illinois, the warden reported that the county had long cooperated with the Immigration Service in detaining Mexican workers, but he says the Cubans are special. Quote, "We usually held Mexicans about 15 days in the county jail, but now it's just forever." Okay, so even as the federal government built new facilities of its own, jails continued to serve an essential function. So in 1996, there is this massive scandal at my hometown detention center of Chrome. Congress comes to visit. They do all of these incredibly shady things. They physically hide migrants in the closet. It's a big scandal. So in the wake of scandal, what are they going to do? They're going to take migrants out of Chrome and send them to county jails. So we actually have really great records of at least one of these jails, which again is quite rare. But I want to show you one of the sources I found. So this is an investigation into the use of electrified weapons against refugees and asylum seekers. So this illustration is made by an Afro-Cuban refugee, and he is describing, right, he says, when we would protest about conditions, when we would attempt to organize in this jail in Mariana County, Florida, they would threaten us, right? They would hold us down with these electrified weapons. So it is basically a description of torture. And I think what is, besides just the pure horror of this, right, what is sort of important is that it reminds us that people who are being held in jails are facing different forms of violence. So these electrified weapons were banned in immigration service facilities. They couldn't be used. But when people were sent to local jails, they were by the rules of the locality. Okay. So even as the Immigration Service, right, claims it is reforming its facilities, it means that the vast majority of people are not being impacted by these reforms. Okay, so I'm going to wrap up. So today, ICE acquires about 87% of its detention sites through something called intergovernmental service agreements. So these are arrangements between federal and local governments. So the federal government contracts with the locality for detention services, and then the local government can decide how it will provide those detention services. So in most cases, that means hiring a private prison company, hiring a private contractor. Okay, so the reason that the federal government likes this, the reason that ICE likes this, is because localities are not sort of subject to the same very cumbersome contracting requirements that the feds are. But I think the other reason they really like it is it just makes all of this harder to see. Like, I think most of us do not perceive, like, we know, right, that private prison companies have a big role in immigration detention. I think most people do not perceive that localities are working as a middleman for the vast majority of those private prison contracts, okay? So we know that jails and sheriffs, or we know that sheriffs claim, right, that many of these jails could not stay open without this federal money. And we know, right, that just this is a massive system of intergovernmental cooperation that is undergirding deportation. Okay, so I think that the book's big takeaway is that local politics really matter in immigration law enforcement. And I think that it is something that activists in recent years across the country have probably recognized better than anyone. The Immigration Service, both historically and today, has insulated itself from accountability by creating what I think of as a nesting doll of contracts and subcontracts and arbitrary transfers and dispersed facilities. It makes detention incredibly hard to challenge or even to see. It is a system that has expanded incarceration for citizens and non-citizens alike, fueled by racism, nativism, and the potential for financial profit. That's it.
Okay, so we have time for a Q&A. If anyone has questions, just raise your hand. I'll bring you the mic, and then you can fire away.
Thanks so much. Do you have data on how many people have gone through those systems? I mean, in comparison, you know, to the federal detention.
We do. So the government, there's an appendix in the back of my book. I do not know the numbers off the top of my head, but it differs. So there's moments where more people are in jails than federal facilities. There's moments where there's more people in federal facilities than in jails. But I think what's important is that the sort of reliance on jails never goes away. So even when, even in the moment where they totally embrace private prison companies, they're still sending so many people through jails very, very quietly because they are seen as like the safety valve of this entire system.
Hi, that $62 a day or whatever the fee that they were getting, is that coming out of just sort of a general non-specified fund so that it's not clear what it's for?
From the federal government?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's coming out of the funds for deportation and removal. And it is going into, I've learned, all sorts of local funds. So one of the things that I think is like very fascinating about how localities use this money is that we see in a lot of communities, they're very explicit about sort of what is being funded with migrant detention. So I have a long story about York, Pennsylvania in the 80s and 90s, and they basically say, you know, you're not paying personal property tax in York because we are detaining so many migrants. In Avoyelles, they have the sheriff routinely claims that there's free ambulance service in the parish because they are detaining so many migrants. Okay, so and I think all of these things really matter, right, for how sort of folks get community buy-in to this project, which actually does make people uncomfortable. Like, I think that it's really striking that sort of for as long as this has been going on, regardless of which community, the politics of the community, the population, people raise really big ethical and moral questions about if this is how their community should be making money. But I think, like, especially as it starts to sort of be rationalized as, but look at these things we're funding for you, we start to see that a lot of people are just more on board. York loses this contract, and everyone does, in fact, start paying personal property tax, and people are livid. They say, do whatever you have to do to get this immigration service contract back in York. So,
But I pay federal taxes, and if I were to look at the budget, I can't see that, you know, X hundred thousands of dollars were used to, whatever the word they want to use, to house X thousands of people for this many nights.
No.
That's not,
no.
so it's not clear.
Oh, it's incredibly unclear. It's going to be under, like, deportation expenses broadly. It's going to be under
Expenses.
ICEs broadly. But yeah, no, it is a nightmare to get actual numbers on this. Yeah, the Immigration Service still will not tell you exactly what jails they're working with. They'll say it's flexible, right? And it is. Like, it is always shifting which jails they're working with, but it is like an absolutely staggering lack of transparency at every part of this process. It'll make your brain feel like it's melting.
In New Jersey, do any of the local jails work with ICE that you're aware of? Or is it the county, or is it the state? And in other states, is it mostly local jails that ICE works with, as opposed to the counties and the state?
Yes, so most jails are county level, and most of what ICE is contracting with is county level jails. Historically, New Jersey jails have been incredibly important to the Immigration Service. They have relied incredibly heavily, specifically as efforts at the New York City area airports, right, have become, and more people are being apprehended that way rather than crossing a land border. New Jersey's a really interesting case because in 2021, the governor signed a bill saying that there were going to be no new contracts between county jails and ICE. So there was a moment in roughly 2022 where there were 0 ICE detainees in New Jersey jails, which was remarkable given the history.
2022?
Yeah, in 2022. The law passes in 2021.
What happened to the detainees?
Great question. Yeah, and this is a big tension in this. So the folks who were held, Essex County Jail was the biggest one that was holding people. Many of them are sent to federal immigration detention centers in upstate New York. Many are sent even further. And this is a big question, I think, for activists and folks involved in this work, because it is an incredible victory for activists that New Jersey cuts off these contracts. But there is sort of another side to it, which is that most of these people were not freed, right? Most of these people were actually sent further, in some cases, from where they had legal representation, potentially family. So it has been, in many ways, sort of, again, just a reshuffling.
Another question, I'm sorry to ask so many. Sheriffs are usually very local.
Yes.
Not county level, they're usually, aren't they municipal level?
Sheriffs are county level.
County level, okay. So their jails would be the county level jails.
Yes, exactly.
So we're not really talking about municipal jails
Sometimes.
being used by ICE.
Yeah, sometimes municipal jails are more common in large cities. So, like, ICE is using Rikers for a while. They don't really anymore. But in general, especially, right, and I think that has to do with where ICE considers the most desirable places to hold people. They would rather not hold them in cities, right? ICE's ideal place to hold people is like the middle of Louisiana, right? They are much more interested, both because it's cheaper and also because it is much harder to get legal representation out there. And that's not conspiratorial. They're very explicit about that in the archives, that that is kind of part of how they are imagining this expanding detention system as like weaponizing rural space. And they say these rural sheriffs, these rural communities, they're the ones who need this money the most. And this is the most advantageous place for us to put these people. So yeah, that's why counties, I think, are particularly central to this story.
Thanks for your talk. I know you're a historian and not a prognosticator of what's going to happen, but given the current administration's intention to dramatically increase detentions, how do you think that's likely to play out as far as where people will, what kinds of facilities people will be housed in?
Yeah, it's an open question. I think we've seen some indications of where it's going, and I think a lot of it, a lot of it continues with the logic we've seen, but I think there's also some things that do feel new. So I think two of the big things we've seen that are like a departure from the story that I'm telling about local power is that there's really been an interest in how to use federal, in particular, military resources for detention. And that does appear in this story. There's other moments where the U.S. experiments with that. Like I mentioned, Chrome is built on a missile testing site. So there is a longer history of kind of using military space as detention space. But this would be an expansion of that idea. So we've heard him say, right, that he is going to set up these camps essentially at military bases domestically, and then also at Guantanamo. And Guantanamo is the sort of Guantanamo has had a lure for presidents who want to detain immigrants for decades. It is always this kind of idea they keep in their back pocket as, something they consider to be really desirable in a lot of ways, because they say, what's better than putting people in the middle of Louisiana, where sort of theoretically a lawyer can still get to them, right? It's moving people out of the United States altogether, both because legal aid becomes more difficult, but also just because there's all these like complicated jurisdictional questions. So Guantanamo was used extensively in the 90s. At its peak, it has 45,000 migrants, so it's on par with what Trump is proposing. He is really actually, in some ways, not proposing something that hasn't been done before. What is new about what he's proposing is that it would be people who have already entered the United States who would be moved there, whereas in the 90s, it is folks who are intercepted at sea. So it's a little bit different, but it's also like Guantanamo's been used before, and we know that other countries also have invested really heavily into this idea of offshore detention. So I would say that is like, really, really troubling to me, both because there's American precedent, international precedent, and it just feeds on all these logics, right, of how do you make detention go to sort of the edges and the margins so that you really don't have to be accountable for it.
Hi, I have a question that maybe might or might not be entirely relevant. But as you were detailing like the journalist response and like local responses and communities bringing up moral and ethic questions, I was thinking about how this move of carceral expansion from jails to prisons, like actual federal prison systems, has fostered or engendered or maybe like supported the criminal narrative around undocumented migrants. And if like now that you can see that there's an actual location and they're not being hidden away in jails, now you can accuse them of crimes.
Yeah. No, I think it's so important, right? When we think about sort of how illegality is constructed, I think we think about it a lot in terms of like how we talk and how the law behaves, right? But I think it really does matter that these people are being held in the same places. It matters when there are moments of conflict, right? So another thing I'm really interested in is sort of organizing and uprising by migrants who are in these facilities. And there's massive uprisings, and there's often massive uprisings where citizens and non-citizens are working together, but certainly, right, when they're talked about, it is just like, these are all prisoners. They're all collapsed. And I think like one of the other things that's always striking to me about the early 20th century, and when folks are talking about Chinese exclusion, right, part of sort of the moral urgency they keep pointing to is that these people haven't been accused of a crime, right? We're incarcerating them and they haven't been accused of a crime. But that is not the case anymore, right? Like, both because so many folks, end up in detention because they have some other interaction with the criminal justice system, but also because ever since like 1929 onward, crossing the border illegally is criminalized. So it's not quite as clean. And we hear that language coming up in sort of how the current administration talks, right? As they're trying to expand the power of local law enforcement, they're saying, well, yeah, local law enforcement can go after anyone they suspect of being here illegally because that is a crime. So that line has become so blurred, right? And I think like one of the takeaways for me is just that like any activism around immigration detention kind of cannot separate out immigrants as like particularly deserving of not being in prison, because sort of the way we treat immigrants, right, is going to affect everyone. So I think like all these reforms sort of have to be rooted in like broader critiques of this system rather than kind of signaling immigrants out as like particularly undeserving of incarceration.
I think you said that Guantanamo isn't the only place where the U.S. has sort of offshored immigrants in detention. Do you know where else?
Yeah, so it's the main place. There have been a bunch of other ideas that have been proposed. There's been some, I think it kind of also depends a little bit on like the definition of detention. Like, I think there is like a case to be made that sort of forcing everyone to stop in Mexico is like, could be read as a form of detention. Guantanamo is the main way they've done it though.
Have there been uprisings in the past
At Guantanamo?
at any of these facilities?
Yeah, absolutely. I just wrote a piece. It's in Teen Vogue, if any of you are Teen Vogue readers. It's about an uprising of children and young people at Guantanamo. So the last, after almost everyone, so a little Guantanamo background, they're detaining Cubans and Haitians, and sort of tale as old as time with immigration detention. Cubans and Haitians do not have similar experiences. They both suffer, right? They're both sort of facing horrible conditions in detention, but for Cubans, there is sort of a way out. And the vast majority of Cubans are eventually going to be resettled in the United States. The vast majority of Haitians are not. And the conditions they experience at Guantanamo are wildly different as well. Even just the physical spaces they're held in. Cubans are held in these little cabins, and Haitians are held in these kind of collapsing tents that start blowing away anytime there's a storm. So the camp is cleared out mostly by 1994. The only group of people who are remaining are a group of unaccompanied children. It's about 300 unaccompanied children. It's called Camp 9 at Guantanamo. And they're there for so long. Most of them are there for almost a year in what is basically a makeshift tent city. The US government claims they are trying to find family. It is an open question how hard they are trying to find family. The records of Camp 9 are the single most brutal thing I've ever read in an archive, which is not a low bar. But I think we have absolutely, and I feel like there's almost no memory of it. There's a massive uprising of these kids. It is really quickly suppressed. But it speaks to just the total desperation yeah. So I think that's the important thing, right? Is that people are resisting this practice in sort of obvious ways and also in quiet ways, right? Some people are using the courts. Some people are sort of staging uprisings. There's a lot of different ways resistance looks here, but it is always there. From the 1890s to today, it's always there.
Okay, I was holding to see if there are any more questions. It doesn't, oh, I'm seeing one more, maybe? Was that, oh, just checking a watch? Question, okay.
I just wanted to say that I was involved in Mercer County, where we are. This is our county. When we went to the freeholders and to the county government to have them stop cooperating with ICE. And it was really a very interesting process because the people that should have known didn't really even know. They were the county commissioners now, they're called the freeholders, were like, what are you talking about, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, half of them had never really paid any attention to it. And, you know, and in all truth, the sheriff liked it.
Yeah. There's no incentive to
No.
loop more people into
Yeah,
this.
yeah,
Yeah.
And that we had already passed bail reform in New Jersey. And that meant that the county jails had hardly any people in them anymore. So it was an interesting dynamic to be involved in. I
Yeah.
just wanted to share that
Oh, I would
because, you
love to
know,
hear
there
more
was
about
all
that.
this sort of, you know, them acting like, oh, we would never do, oh, yes, you are doing it, you know. And they had to change. They
Yeah.
don't do it anymore. And the county is very serious about it and doesn't allow any of that. So, and the state doesn't either. But now we have several places that are being bought as private detention, and one of them is in Trenton,
Yes. Yeah.
and that's right in our neighborhood.
Yeah. Yeah. I would love to hear more about that. I just want to say real quick, like, that's a big thing we're seeing in Louisiana as well. Like, Louisiana has passed some sort of progressive criminal justice reform efforts in recent years, particularly to sort of get more people pre-trial, especially out of jail. And the sort of really unintended consequence of that has been that sheriffs say, we have empty jail beds now, right? So basically, they're not actually sort of decreasing incarceration, they are changing who they incarcerate. And there's really strong economic incentives there too. A lot of them are paying off bonds for this construction of bigger jails. So they say, we have no way to pay this off if we can't fill these jail beds. So it is just like totally perverse incentives all the way down.
Okay, so we're at 7 o'clock. I think we should thank Brianna one more time for a really illuminating presentation.